Hello, everyone. This is Charles Crocker from the Community Action Partnership, and welcome to this afternoon's video, the second in our ongoing series in strategic planning. Last week, we talked about the big picture with strategic planning and getting prepared to plan, and today we are going to take a look at collecting the data that you need to conduct a strategic plan. Before we get going, I want to do some quick housekeeping. First of all, this webinar is being recorded. You'll be able to access the webinar recording and the PowerPoint for the slides on the partnership website. We usually are able to get those up within a couple of days, so we should have the video and the slides posted from Friday's webinar shortly within the next day or two, and the video and slides from this afternoon's webinar posted by the end of the week. Of course, you can reach out to both myself and my fellow presenter, Courtney Kohler, if you have any additional questions or if you want us to send the slides directly. Another couple of check-ins. If you would like to ask questions during the webinar, everyone is muted on entry, but you can use both the question and answer function and the chat function if you need any additional assistance. So please don't hesitate to send out the questions. We'll try to answer them in the order that they come in. And also you can always follow up directly with both Courtney and myself if you want to ask any additional questions. I see a couple of questions about folks saying that they don't have sound through their computer. If you're having trouble with the sound on your computer, you can always just dial in through the audio connection. If you just go to the event info tab, that should give you the instructions and the call-in number. So try the phone if you're having trouble getting the audio through your computer. We're going to get going in just one second, but I also want to introduce my co-presenter. Courtney, you want to say a few words?
Sure. Hi, this is Courtney Kohler. I'm a Senior Associate with the Community Action Partnership, and I'll be presenting with Charles today on strategic planning.
Great. Thank you so much, Courtney. So as I said, we're now going to jump on into this afternoon's webinar. So Courtney has hit record, so everything after this will be available again on our website. You can access that through the Tools and Resources section, and I'll show you a screenshot in just a couple of slides. So first of all, a quick overview of the agenda, what we're going to be discussing this afternoon or this late morning if you're calling in from the Pacific Coast. We're going to begin with talking about collecting agency data. So looking at what data internally within your agency you probably already have to prepare for the strategic planning process. We'll, of course, highlight the importance of your community needs assessment, but there's also some other sources of data that you probably want to make sure you have on hand. Next, Courtney is going to talk about conducting a SWOT analysis, and of course that is looking at your agency's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. That's a common exercise you go through in the strategic planning process. So Courtney will talk about how to put that exercise together and how to use the data to support your strategic plan. And then finally, Courtney and I will go back and forth talking about how you review your vision, mission, and values, and how you pull that forward as you move into the next phase of the strategic planning process, actually writing your strategic plan. So that's what we're going to cover today. A couple of other things that I want to make sure everybody on the phone or on the web is aware of. First of all, we have the Partnership Strategic Planning Guide. That's our comprehensive guide to community action strategic planning. This guide covers what we'll be discussing in this afternoon's webinar in a lot of detail. There are also additional resources in the guide, additional resources on things like conducting a SWOT analysis, links to other web pages, other guides about how to go through a SWOT analysis, and some with a few interesting twists. There are a number of different ways to do that, and so this guide has additional resources that you would certainly want to access, and we also recommend that agencies take a look at the guide when they're beginning their strategic planning process. It's written specifically for community action agencies, and we make sure to cover a number of different community action specific things that you're going to need to take into account when you do strategic planning. like requirements of the CSBG Act, how to incorporate the Roma cycle into your strategic planning process, making sure you're meeting the organizational standards, and a number of other specific things for community action agencies as you do strategic planning. So make sure you take a look at that guide. It's also a great resource for board members, for staff who are preparing to go through the strategic planning process. And certainly if you have a consultant that you're using, I would write it into their contract so that they review the strategic planning guide just to make sure they know what's unique about how to do strategic planning with community action agencies. And you can access the strategic planning guide on the partnership's website. If you see on your screen, circled in yellow is that tools and resources drop-down menu. That's where we keep all of our publications. There are also links to our webinars and other resources. So it's really your one-stop shop for training and technical assistance tools. We update our resources regularly, so make sure you come back to that page, take a look, and if you have any trouble accessing the strategic planning guide or other resources, just shoot an email directly to either Courtney or myself, and we'll make sure to get you set up. So to start out, what do you want to do in the beginning, sort of from a big picture perspective, thinking about your strategic plan? So just to bring you up to date in case you weren't able to listen in last week, in the first phase of the strategic planning process, your executive director and leadership team have met. They've reviewed a number of diagnostic questions. Those are included in the slides from last week. They're also in that strategic planning guide to make sure that the agency is prepared to plan. The executive director and the board then have a conversation looking forward, making sure that they're ready, that they're on the same page, that the board and the leadership team are in congruence about the overall objectives for strategic planning, that, for example, board members who might not have been through a strategic planning process have their questions answered, they get up to speed, and that you've selected a date far enough out to give you enough time to fully prepare and to make sure that the folks who are involved in the strategic planning process know exactly when it's going to kick off and what needs to happen between when you initiate and actually writing the strategic plan. The last stage that we talked about was putting together your planning committee, and we suggested that your planning committee be composed of core staff who have a background in strategic planning or other related skills. For example, your Roma trainers, your Roma implementers, folks with facilitation experience, folks with data collection or research experience, people good with logistics. So basically your core team that's going to be responsible for keeping the process moving forward. So once you have put that team together, one of the very next things that team does is start to look at the research needs that you're going to have for that strategic planning process. So we'll talk about those three different steps in the process. Of course, you can change it up a little bit. You'll probably be collecting more general data throughout this research phase, but we usually suggest that the next phase, the next thing you would do would be the SWOT analysis, and again, Courtney will take you through that, and then you wrap that up with a big picture look at your agency's vision, mission, and values, and we'll go into a lot more detail about what you would look at for that stage of the process. So, again, just to make sure you're situated, this phase of the process probably begins about a month after you formally made the decision to move forward with your strategic planning process, but you're still somewhere around 6 to 12 months out from actually initiating the process. And again, we always suggest that you leave that amount of time because there might be issues that you need to address, that you want to make sure that staff knows when the process is going to begin, that other events aren't scheduled over top of it, and that folks know to reserve those blocks of time that you've marked out on your calendar to make sure that they can fully focus on the process. And of course, as community action agencies, we tend to be fairly busy, schedules fill up, so it does, I think, behoove everyone to use that sort of 6 to 12 month rule of thumb, especially depending on how large your agency is. So a bigger agency is probably going to take a little bit more time to get prepared, and of course, this research phase is one of the things that you want to make sure that you've left enough time for. So the first step, you've got your organizing committee or your planning committee together, and what you want to do as that first step in research is collect the data that you already have easy access to as an agency. So what I always suggest to our agencies is that you set up a shared folder on your organization or your agency drive that everyone can have access to, because you want to make sure that everyone involved in the process has a common background. I think that's one of the things that's important to point out about strategic planning. It's really an opportunity to get staff from all parts of the organization, from frontline workers to managers to your senior leaders and, of course, your board on the same page about where you are as an agency, what your mission is, how well you've been doing, both from a big picture perspective and on down to the program level. And so one way you can do this is to make sure folks are reviewing the data and the research that you're putting together. And these documents, I think, are just generally good resources for an agency to have on hand, but connected with the strategic planning process, they help you begin to put together that overall big picture of how your agency is doing. So at the very top of the list, you definitely want your previous strategic plan, and I would start there with your planning committee. Make sure that everyone on the planning committee has reviewed the strategic plan. Make sure the board and the leadership team has reviewed it, and of course sometimes the strategic plan does fall by the wayside. You may find it on the top shelf of your executive director's office bookcase or maybe in the circular file, but it's a good opportunity to review that, and that also lets you do some thinking about what went right and where there were opportunities for improvement in the last process. So if nobody can find the strategic plan, or you find that it's not really a document that was used much over the last 3 to 5 years, it's also a good opportunity to do some thinking, because you're still in that planning stage of figuring out where you might need to make some adjustments based on what worked and what didn't work in the last time you went through the strategic planning process. Next, and this is crucially important, you want at least the summary data from your needs assessment process. And we talked about this on Friday, but the strategic plan is really the connection to and continuation of the needs assessment process. So obviously with the needs assessment, you've identified your community needs and your community assets, and the strategic plan is what is your agency's response to the needs of the community. It answers the question, what are you going to do as an agency and a network of partners to address the needs that you've identified in the needs assessment? And so having the needs assessment in a readable format and both certainly the long form, but a summary of the needs assessment I think is really important. Not everyone is going to read 50 pages or 100 pages. So having that summary, those top level needs, and also the analysis of the needs. Hopefully in your key findings section, you've done an analysis of the causes and conditions of the needs that you've identified. So this is your opportunity to make sure that everybody is familiar with that document. You may want to even have an agency session to review those key findings, but certainly the folks on the planning committee and the leadership team should make sure they re-familiarize themselves with this document. You might even want to do a quick board presentation to refresh your board members. Now, we always suggest that you try to do the strategic plan as close to the needs assessment as possible. I wouldn't wait longer than a year to do that, but again, remember that they're really the same part of a longer process. This is all part of our results-oriented management and accountability framework. So even though the needs assessment starts us out, that first step in our ROMA cycle, the assessment phase, and strategic planning moves us into the second phase of the ROMA cycle, the planning phase. This is really an extension of one long planning process. So don't think of your needs assessment and your strategic plan as separate processes. They are really extensions of going through the full ROMA cycle as an agency. So you want to try to do those as close as possible. The next document that you want access to is your agency-wide budget. You want to look at your financial position as an agency. You want to make sure you are on a firm financial footing, that you're sustainable, and you want to make sure folks are familiar with your overall financial position, especially as they go into looking at your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats as an agency. You're also going to want to include your output and outcome data from your programs and services. You're going to want folks who are participating in the strategic planning process to know how your programs are doing. And I think this is true for a couple of reasons. Sometimes we do tend to be in our own programmatic silos, and strategic planning is an opportunity for the agency to take that step back and try to look at that whole 360-degree picture. And so this is a great chance for folks in different parts of the agency to learn a little bit more about those other programs and services that they might not be connected to on a day-to-day basis, and also learn about what other folks are doing and take a look at both the outputs, so things like how many customers are served by the different programs, and the outcomes, so what do those programs actually achieve, because you're going to want to be able to take that into account when you ultimately do your strategic plan. You're going to want to know what programs and services are working, which ones are producing good outcomes, where there might be some areas where there's room for improvement, and where there might be some things where you might want to shift some resources or reprioritize simply because you're either not getting the outcomes you want, or maybe the community needs have shifted, and it makes sense to look at other opportunities to serve the community. You're also going to want to include your customer satisfaction data, and this is required by the organizational standards. So again, make sure that you're including that data, but it's also a good opportunity again to review your customer feedback, see if there are trends, either positive or negative, for customer satisfaction for different programs and services, and again, a good opportunity to take a look at your overall customer satisfaction system, see if it's producing the type of data that's going to be helpful. I know sometimes agencies only have the time and resources to collect some customer satisfaction data some of the time, and that's why you want to leave yourself that 6 to 12-month window, because you may find out that you need to collect some additional data in order to get that big picture. As with both the customer satisfaction data and your output and outcome data, it's also a good opportunity to ask yourself, are you reporting in a way that really helps you analyze the data? Do you only have program reports or service reports, program by program or service by service? Do you have an agency scorecard that gives you the big picture in an easy-to-read way? Or is that data difficult to assemble and put together? So it's also that opportunity to take a look at how you're collecting data internally and maybe do some tweaks and improvements if you find that the data is challenging, or otherwise there might be some room for improvement in how you're collecting and presenting that data. And then finally, you're going to want to include any key studies and reports that are going to help you with the strategic planning process. So say your agency does a lot of workforce development. You may want to look at public agencies, other nonprofits, your local community college or university that might have done a report on workforce issues in your area. Same thing across all your different service areas. If you do work on early childhood, transportation, housing, you're going to want to collect some of the key reports that will provide additional insights that you'd want to be familiar with as you move forward with the strategic planning process. And so I don't think that this is, a process where you would, literally be collecting dozens and dozens of reports. These are the key, maybe 5 to 10 reports, and of course, nobody's going to read much more than that, other than maybe the executive summary. So it's an opportunity to figure out what is that key data. If there are a couple of big picture overviews of what's going on in your service area, in some of the key areas where you provide programs and services that can help you get that big picture, this is a great time to make sure that folks are aware of those resources. Maybe you can hold a couple of educational or discussion sessions with key staff to make sure they're aware of those reports. But again, this is all part of the process of making sure that your staff has a shared picture of the agency, your agency's external environment, to form that foundation to do good strategic planning. So make sure that you collect all this information on a shared drive. And like I said, don't just put it on the shared drive and send an email to folks saying where it is. Try to be intentional about scheduling opportunities to come together and discuss what the data says about the agency. That's a real opportunity to educate folks from different parts of your agency, as I said, about different programs and services, about the needs assessment, about external program reports that could be useful to you in the strategic planning process. And I think if you do it right, you really hopefully energize folks and create that shared big picture understanding of where your agency is, laying that good foundation to do good strategic planning. As you're going through this process, as your planning committee is collecting those documents, hopefully pulling folks together to have those discussions, you also want to be identifying stakeholders, both internal and external, who are going to participate in the research phase. And Courtney, in a second, is going to talk about the SWOT analysis. So you want to be looking at those internal stakeholders to figure out the best way to bring them together to collect the SWOT analysis. So looking at your board, your leadership team, the different functional units in your agency like HR, finance, and of course your different programs and services, and maybe thinking about different levels of staff. So looking at and thinking about how you would connect with your frontline staff, your program managers, your leadership team, and your board. So again, this should be a 360-degree process. Strategic planning should be participatory, inclusive, and collaborative, and so the planning committee should take this opportunity early on to really do that thinking about who your internal stakeholders are and begin to think about how you're going to engage them in the strategic planning process, and doing those shorter meetings to get folks up to speed on your last strategic plan, on your needs assessment data, on other key agency data, is a great opportunity to make sure you're reaching out to the right people and connecting with those stakeholders. You may also want to take a look at your external stakeholders. There may be people you want to go to do some fill-in interviews, get some additional advice from. So making that list at the very beginning, make sure that you're not leaving anybody out, and you're going to the folks who could potentially give you some good feedback and good ideas about the strategic direction that your agency should take. So this is a great opportunity to make sure that you've mapped out those internal and external stakeholders and are thinking about how to involve them in the strategic planning process, starting with the SWOT process. And Courtney is going to talk a little bit more about how you would put that SWOT process together, but I really think SWOT is a great way to engage a large number of stakeholders right out of the gate, make sure folks feel like they're engaged in the process, that they're being listened to, and of course it gives you that opportunity to create that shared picture of how your agency is doing. So the last thing that you want to do, knowing that you're going to conduct a SWOT analysis, or at least a similar exercise, there are some other options, again, that are discussed in our guide, but we'll focus on the SWOT analysis. Knowing that you're going to review your vision, your mission, your values, you may want to collect some additional data. You may want to do some key informant interviews with your close partners. They may be able to give you some good feedback on their ideas about strategic directions for your agencies. You may want to do some additional focus groups with your customers if you find out that you need to gather some additional customer service information. And you may want to pull folks together in a larger group context. So you might want to have a community forum to get some feedback about the direction that your agency is going. And as we said the last time around, connecting to your community needs assessment, you might think about doing some of these exercises and data collection activities as part of your community needs assessment to make sure that you're connected to your strategic plan. And it's just a great opportunity to do that research and data collection in as efficient way as possible. And of course, you may want to do some additional archival research on technical issues, again, looking at those overall reports about what's going on in your service area in those different areas where your agency is focused, like housing, workforce development, early childhood. Of course, you'll probably find a number of different reports. So again, that lead time gives you the opportunity to collect that information, synthesize it, and get it out to the right stakeholders. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Courtney to talk about conducting the SWOT analysis.
All right. Thank you, Jarl. So I'm going to be talking about the SWOT analysis, which many of you might be somewhat familiar with, but just going to go through some different tips and how this can be helpful in gathering data for your strategic planning. So the SWOT stands for Strengths, Weaknesses, Opportunities, and Threats. And really what you're looking at when you're looking at strengths, you're looking at things that are internal, within your agency, and you're looking at what can be helpful, what is beneficial, what are kind of those competencies that your agency has to build upon. And then with weaknesses, those are also internal, but those are things that are maybe more harmful. So, maybe in some deficiencies that are present, or, where capacity might be lacking at the time, things like that you want to make sure you're considering as you plan. And then with opportunities and threats, both of those are more external. And opportunities are those things that you might be able to, kind of go after or build upon that are out there. Threats are those things that you want to kind of be able to protect the agency from that might be more harmful in the environment that your agency is operating within. So as far as what is the SWOT analysis, it's really assessing for the internal and external factors in preparation for change. And so, really looking at what the agency is doing well. So again, kind of those competencies that the agency has. And then really sharing the successes across the agency, and that helps build morale. So that's one thing that this exercise does, in addition to just helping you plan, is that it can really help you reflect on what has gone well in the past few years. And then also looking at how to build on the current strengths. So you always want to be able to leverage those things that are going well, leverage the competencies that your agency has. Maybe there's financial strength or staff capacity strength, and those are things that can really be utilized in the planning process throughout the strategies that you're conducting. And then looking at areas for improvement, this is where you're looking at weaknesses. So, also reflecting back on, maybe what hasn't gone so well and why. And then looking at very diverse perspectives from stakeholders can be helpful here too. And this helps to create some buy-in with what Jarl was talking about earlier whenever you're trying to engage and identify those stakeholders for your planning process. Then whenever you're looking at opportunities, these are really looking at those possibilities for the agency. So what's possible, what can we go after, how can we build our agency, what are those opportunities we might need to take, so areas for growth and change for the organization. And then with threats, you're really looking at those external factors that are influencing growth that might be kind of a hindrance to what you're trying to accomplish. So really being realistic and proactive with the strengths and opportunities can help here, and really seeing how you're going to overcome those barriers or obstacles that are out there. So then this is actually a matrix from the Community Toolbox. It's adapted from the Fred David Strategic Management text, but it kind of digs deeper into, it takes the SWOT and kind of transitions it over into looking at some strategies. And it goes through and does kind of a matrix, a double matrix almost, of your SWOT analysis. So you still look at your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats like you see around the corners of the box. But then whenever you're looking at kind of cross-examining them, you're looking at, the opportunity strength strategies. So for example, how will we use our strengths to take advantage of opportunities? So this really kind of helps look at whenever you're looking at, what strengths the organization has and how they can be leveraged, looking at how those strengths can very much contribute to the opportunities that you might be able to take. Same with the opportunity weakness strategies. How can we overcome our weaknesses by taking advantage of opportunities? Threat strength strategies, how can we use our strengths to then avoid the threats or overcome those obstacles that are out there? And the threat weakness strategies, how can we minimize our weaknesses and avoid threats? So it kind of helps to crosswalk the different pieces that you're looking at and kind of phase into the strategy making sessions. And another note on that, which we'll note this at the end as well, but the Community Toolbox does have a lot of great resources around strategic planning. They actually have a whole toolbox of things with the community needs assessment and developing community partnerships. But strategic planning is a specific chapter that they have within their toolbox. Is Chapter 8. So that link will be included at the end of this webinar. So as far as the strengths and weaknesses that you're looking at, these are of course all the internal, like I mentioned before. So you're looking at programs and services within your agency. You're looking at the customer satisfaction data and the input that you get from your community. You're looking at partnerships with the key stakeholders and the different sectors within the community. You're also looking at the outreach, awareness, and advocacy. So how are you getting your agency out there? What are your strategies around that? What is your advocacy like? Looking at human resources and staff. This one is a big one at looking at your staff capacity and what you're capable of doing with the staff that you have to carry out strategies for your planning process. And then your facilities, looking at, how many you might have, the shape that they're in, things like that. And then, of course, funding and budget is a key piece that comes into this as well. And really looking at what resources do you have to be able to carry out the plan that you propose. So having all of this information ahead of time is very helpful to be able to, identify what these strengths and weaknesses are. So like Jarl said before, making sure that you're bringing the appropriate information so that you're easily able to walk through these different items within strengths and weaknesses. Then really, whenever you're looking at opportunities and threats, of course, again, this is more of the external, and this really serves as kind of an environmental scan. So like, what is the environment that we're within that we have to work with right now? And so there's an acronym that goes along with this to kind of help remember what you're looking for when you're identifying opportunities and threats, and it's PESTLE. So the first one you want to look at is political environment, which, as we know, that can be a major factor in what you're trying to accomplish as an agency. But your political environment, you're looking at the legislation, the regulations, as well as the funding that's available or current, funding cuts, things like that might affect your operations with your agency. Then you're looking at, for the E, you're looking at economics. So what is kind of that industry that you're in right now? What are labor and wages? What can you offer staff? That sort of thing. Then looking at social, so looking at discrimination and equity. So looking at that environment around you, depending on where you might be at in the country, and just what's kind of going on in the world right now is something that can be either a threat or even sometimes an opportunity to what you're looking at doing and how you're going to carry out your strategies. Then the technological, so looking at data advances, what are the requirements we have to meet for certain programs and funding, and taking all of that into account. Then legal, what kind of court cases are out there, what might be up against the agency or might be affecting the community that you're within. And then the environmental, so really looking at the infrastructure that you're within and just kind of that environmental justice environment within the areas that you serve. So there's some different process options for the SWOT analysis. You can do a large group kind of open space exercise. And one idea for this is that you could gather a large group of staff, stakeholders, and board together and put up flip charts around the room, flip chart paper around the room, and then allow people to kind of have some individual time to write on sticky notes what the strengths, opportunities, weaknesses, and threats are. And then they can go and post those around the room, and then you kind of do this large group discussion and see how the different thoughts kind of merge across the room. You can also do small groups of diverse stakeholders, so kind of bringing people together around different issue areas and processing that way. Then you can also do individual issues by kind of expert groups, so bringing people together to talk about specific topics that they have expertise within, and that can be helpful, especially whenever you might be looking at program-specific, strengths and weaknesses. Not everybody might be well-versed in certain areas, such as housing, And so being able to get the right people talking about the specific strengths and weaknesses around those specific topics. And then another process, it's not on the screen, but another way that you can process it is to kind of gather the information through a survey or ahead of time, and then being able to compile kind of a SWOT analysis for people to react to, and then have some additional conversation on that. So it kind of depends on what timing you have available to do this in, but sometimes that can help cut down on what timing you might be able to have in person with people, is to gather some of that information ahead of time through some sort of survey, and then be able to get that reaction discussion going once it's kind of a first phase is designed. Then some different tips for the SWOT analysis. Of course, you want to include a diverse group of stakeholders. So this really helps get the buy-in, like we mentioned earlier, and also really build the capacity around what you're trying to do. A large group with a recorder or attendees with sticky notes. So you want to make sure that you're documenting this somehow, because a lot of this information can get lost very easily after the session. And so making sure that you have someone that's taking notes. That's why the process option that I mentioned earlier about putting all the sticky notes on flip charts can really actually be helpful, because then you have basically you have your attendees taking the notes for you. And then you kind of keep that back to refer back to. And then you can do small groups, which then kind of report out and prioritize as you're gathering those stakeholders together. And so making sure that you're including all of these different perspectives is really important when you gather the people together for the SWOT analysis. Then you also want to make sure that the group is clear on what each category means. And so sometimes it can be, whenever you're looking at strengths and opportunities, sometimes those can get mixed together. Sometimes the internal and external can get a little bit confusing for people, and you can kind of mix it up. So you want to be sure that people are clear on what we're talking about within each category. Then also consider sharing the community needs assessment and customer satisfaction results to start the discussion. So this might be able to be shared ahead of time, so that people can start thinking through and really raise their thoughts based on the data. So you want this to be kind of an evidence-based process, so that what people are talking about, there's something to back it up. And so being able to have this data from your needs assessment and customer satisfaction surveys is very important for people to be aware of. Then you also want to schedule enough time to really dig deeper with the analysis of it. So not just listing out what strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are, but really asking, the question of why, or looking at what's behind maybe a strength or an opportunity or a threat. And then that way you can really, capitalize on the strengths to take advantage of opportunities and see how the things work together. So that kind of cross-matrix option can be good for digging deeper. And then you can really talk through how these results will end up influencing the agency strategy. So those are some tips on SWOT analysis. And then I'm going to hand it back over to Jarl. He's going to talk a little bit about the vision, mission, and values.
Sure. Thanks so much, Courtney. So the SWOT analysis is obviously designed to be a more big picture, participatory exercise. But now you move into sort of the final stage of the data collection process, and this is assessing your vision, mission, and values. And so you can do this as part of the SWOT exercise. You can incorporate some of the questions and techniques Courtney and I are going to talk about. But typically, I think this is something that should probably be a discussion that occurs between the leadership team and the board. And one of the things that we emphasized in the last webinar on Friday was that your board really needs to play a significant role in the strategic planning process, but primarily one that's giving the agency strategic advice about which direction to go as an agency. So again, this exercise is typically conducted with a smaller group than you would do with a SWOT analysis. I would suggest that you do it with your full board, but if that's difficult to pull together, you could do it with a committee of the board and report out on the results and have a shorter discussion with the full board. Whatever your agency, whatever works for your agency based on how you typically interact with your board, and pragmatically what their availability is. We know some agencies cover significant service areas. It can be difficult to get board members together in person, but I think that this is an important enough discussion that you want to make sure that you're giving it enough time. Another alternative would be to do a more piecemeal conversation that occurred over several board meetings, if it's tough to get people together. But these are pretty significant questions that you want to discuss, as you'll see, and so you want to make sure that there's enough time for that to happen. I would suggest that you have a facilitator that helps you with this process so your leadership team and board can participate fully, and it may raise some challenging questions that you would want somebody in the room that can manage those conversations and, again, let the leadership team and the board fully participate in their formal roles. Also to point out, Standard 4.1 requires that the governing board has reviewed within the organization's past 5 years and assured that the mission addresses poverty and that the organization's programs and services are in alignment with the mission. So make sure that you're taking a look at that Standard 4.1, but if you go through this exercise as we discussed, it'll make sure that you are in compliance with Standard 4.1. So from a big picture perspective, this is really your opportunity to make sure that your agency is on track, that you're addressing the high priority needs that you've identified in your needs assessment, that your programs and services are aligned with your mission, and that your programs and services are getting good outcomes and results. And so we'll walk through a number of diagnostic questions that you would want to make sure that you ask your leadership team and your board to make sure that you're again, getting that 360-degree view of how your agency is really functioning. And of course, your mission and vision are your organizational compass, making sure that you're aligned with the anti-poverty work of community action, that you're targeting those high priority needs you've identified in your needs assessment, and of course, the values discussion. Make sure that your agency is on track in terms of practicing what it preaches. And that includes values internally, what your organizational culture is like, how you're actualizing the values of community action, and also how you're interacting with your customers, the communities that they live in, your key partners, and the rest of the community as a whole. So it's that opportunity to take that 360-degree look at your agency and what's going on. So I'm going to turn it back over to Courtney to talk a little bit about kicking off this discussion with looking at your agency's vision.
All right. So whenever you're reviewing your vision statement, the difference between the mission and vision, of course, Jarl alluded to it a little bit, but you got to remember that the vision is really that big picture. And so this is really looking at the ideal. If everything you did as an agency worked, what would the community look like? You also want your vision to be inspiring, but it also should be reachable, and it shouldn't be it should be a reach, actually, but it should be something that would actually be able to be accomplished. And then it shouldn't be a novel. It should be kept very brief. Your vision statement should. And it shouldn't just be one person's vision in the agency, such as the executive director or one person on the board, but it should really be that collective vision of not only the agency, but the community that you're serving as well. And then when things are hard and when you're exhausted and you want to be able to look up at your vision and say, this is why we're doing this. And so that's really another point of the vision, is to kind of help bring that inspiration back and really help ground the work that your agency is doing. And really being able to believe that your community has the potential to be able to look like that or do that. And so some of the different questions you might want to consider as you're reviewing your vision statement. You want to know, does it describe your agency's optimal goal and reasons for existence? Does it describe the ideal conditions of how the community would look if these agency goals were completely addressed? Does it present an inspiring view of the preferred future? Is it brief and easy to communicate? And then is it shared by members of the community? So these can kind of serve as those diagnostic questions that you can look at as you're looking at your vision statement with your board and staff and key people. All right, so on the next slide, talking about the key components of the mission, kind of based in the Roma curriculum. And so there's 4 different pieces to the mission that you want to look at, especially in accordance with Roma. So these are population, services, outcomes, and relationships. And so you want to, when you're looking at these, the population is really looking at, who are you serving? What is unique about them? Where are they located? That sort of thing. Those are just some things you want to consider. Then with services, you want to look at what are you doing? What do you offer? And how is the agency addressing the need? What is your overarching strategy? That sort of thing. So those things should be reflected within the vision statement, or the mission statement, excuse me. And then as far as the outcomes go, you want to look at, why are we doing this work? What is the end goal? What part of poverty do you see that might need to be changed? And then the relationship is really looking at, how are you working with others? Who are you working with to be able to accomplish this work? Because a lot of times it's not, can't be done just solo. And so we need to be able to work with the community and key partners to be able to accomplish a mission. So the mission is really kind of that more brief or more actualized piece of the vision and how you're actually carrying out. So that's why you're looking at these components of the population, services, outcomes, and relationship, because it looks at kind of how you're doing it, with who you're doing it for, and that sort of thing. So the example there at the bottom of the slide, you can see that to work with community allies to serve, and that's kind of describing the relationship piece, serving the people of Waialae County, so that's the population, multi-generational services, which is the services, obviously, and to achieve self-sufficiency. So that's kind of the why or the outcome of the agency and the mission statement. Okay, so Jarl's going to go through some diagnostic questions for reviewing your mission statement.
Sure, thanks so much, Courtney. And before we jump in, we've had a couple of questions come in. The first one is, just given the objectives of the strategic planning process, what can you do when your hands are tied by a state funding stream, a state office, other conditions that make it difficult to do, comprehensive, ambitious, big picture change? And so we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail on the next webinar when we talk about looking at what strategies that you're going to implement to achieve the outcomes that you're going to define for your strategic plan. So, we'll talk a little bit more about your options. We certainly recognize there are a lot of constraints on our agencies. Obviously, you're constrained by the overall amount of resources you have access to. You're constrained by categorical requirements that limit what you can spend your money on, particular populations, particular types of services. And that's one of the real values of the strategic planning process, because it's your opportunity to take a step back and say, well, what can we do realistically, given the constraints we're under, given the overall resources that we have access to, and what makes the most sense. So if you're not able to access additional resources, if the funding is extremely tight, if you're struggling with some of those challenges with categorical requirements, there may be things like internal changes that you could do. So, one example would be to look at developing a single intake system if your agency is especially siloed, or looking at internal improvements that you could do with a small investment of resources. Other examples would be looking at what other community partners that you could connect with. Are there additional services that you could offer your customers by accessing networks that you might not have as close connections to, or you might not have MOUs with, to do that shared referral system? Other things might be looking at policy advocacy work, bringing together a collaborative of stakeholders to maybe look at getting a waiver on some of those categorical requirements that would free up some of those resources to be spent a little bit more flexibly. Again, we'll really delve into that question in more detail on the next webinar, because that's what you're trying to do when you look at the strategies that you're ultimately going to implement. But Courtney and I are more than happy to follow up with folks who want to talk about that issue more directly offline. We also had another question that came in about what happens with your needs assessment when you find a new population that's been overlooked. So can you continue to just build on your strengths as an agency? And what happens in those situations where you might have identified new needs that you might have to access new resources, apply for additional grants if you're going to serve them? So I want to start out by just emphasizing that with your needs assessment, you don't have to address every single need that you've identified in your needs assessment. We know our resources as community action agencies are limited, and that's really the value, another value of the strategic planning process. You're sitting down and saying, based on our needs assessment, based on where we are currently providing services, what are the kind of outcomes we're getting? Are there needs that might be not being addressed, or populations that might be slipping through the cracks, and what do we do about them? Is it something where we might want to go after a new grant to try to fill that gap? Is there another service provider that we could partner with? Is it an issue of just lack of resources, and we might want to put a collaborative together to do some advocacy work? And that's really what you're doing in this phase of the process, is figuring out where are those populations that might not be being served, where are those significant unmet needs, and preparing to then make some decisions in the next phase of the process about how you're going to address them. So the questions you see up on the screen are one way to diagnose where those cracks might be in the overall safety net or systems of services, where might be those underserved populations, and then as you move into the next section or the next phase of the strategic planning process, what are you actually going to do to address that? So this is the beginning of that process to help you figure out, sort of what are your priorities, and then in the next webinar, we'll talk about developing strategies to address those needs. So the questions you see up on the screen are the diagnostic questions that we suggest that your leadership team and board discuss. Now, of course, these aren't written in stone. They're just our suggestions, so you're more than free to adapt them to meet your needs. These are included in that guide to strategic planning, so they're discussed in a little bit more detail in that section. But I think you would start out by asking by looking at your needs assessment and reviewing those high priority needs, and asking what are the primary needs of the families, organizations, and communities that we serve. Then you want to have at least an initial discussion about what goals you want to achieve for the families, organizations, and communities in your service area. You might look at your previous strategic plan, look at the outcomes that you identified, the strategies that you developed, and look at whether they're in line with your most recent needs assessment. So there might have been shifts in needs, there might be new populations, there might have been changes in the priorities of the needs in the community. So that's an opportunity, again, to look at how you're doing based on your needs assessment. Then next up, I think, is a really important question. What is your core business and primary services, or your core business areas in your primary services? So this basically answers the question, what's your identity as a community action agency? Are you the workforce development, housing, and early childhood services agency? So who are you? What makes you more than just a collection of siloed services? And that helps you put your core business areas against the results of the needs assessment and say, are we providing services that really address the underlying needs that have been identified through the needs assessment? Do we need to shift those resources around? Are we too siloed? Do we have a clear identity of what kind of services that we're providing? Then you could discuss your service delivery strategies. So, do you have a clear set of service delivery strategies? Are you moving towards integrated or bundled services? Do you really rely on a referral network to bring together other agencies to provide more comprehensive services? So this is a check-in to see sort of the, not necessarily the big picture, but the medium level picture when it comes to providing your programs and services. Do you have clear strategies for delivering services, or are you so programmatically siloed that you're not able to tell that story about how all your programs and services fit together in an overall strategy to meet the needs of your customers, your communities, and your service area? Also in line with what Courtney was talking about, sort of applying our ROMA principles and practices, you would want to ask some fundamental ROMA questions such as, who are our primary customers, and who are our primary partners, to make sure you're serving the right mix of customers, that you've got the right partners around the table, and again, looking at the overall context of the programs and services you're providing and the needs of your community. You might also want to consider your theory of change as an agency. We talked more about this in the previous webinar, but we have a number of resources to help agencies develop an agency-level theory of change. They're on our tools and resources page. We have some resources for ROMA trainers about going through a process to help your agency develop a theory of change, and there's also a tool on the NASCAS website, and those links are in the slides from the last webinar, which should be posted shortly, or you can just reach out directly to Courtney and myself, and we'll connect you with them. And then the final question you would ask is, are our services, programs, and other activities aligned with our strengths and opportunities and with our mission? So this is sort of the mission drift and alignment question. Are you really focused on pushing your mission forward, on serving your mission? Are you too siloed? Have you had any mission drift? And is there a clear focus and direction for your agency? These are just some additional questions that you might want to ask sort of after that process to focus more in on your programs themselves. So for example, where are you providing services but not achieving outcomes? In other words, where might you need to do better? Where are you providing services but not meeting family and community needs? So, even if you're having good outcomes, you might be only providing them for 10% of the population that needs them. Where are the gaps in services or needs for different types of services? So where are those populations that are falling through the cracks? Where are those places where you could provide more support? Another good question to ask is, on a scale of completely disconnected to highly integrated, where are our services? So if that helps you figure out if there are any, moving into the next phase, any work that you need to do on service alignment, developing a single intake system, bundling services, doing cross-training to provide more case management, or moving to a coaching model. So again, looking at that overall service delivery strategy. And then finally, you might want to ask, how effective is your overall anti-poverty agenda? Because we know our agencies primarily provide programs and services, but most community action agencies also engage in outreach and advocacy. So you should probably ask yourself, how strong is your network of stakeholder relationships? Do you have connections to diverse sectors within the community? What's the overall awareness of poverty and poverty-related issues by your broader community outside your immediate service area? And do you have a strong policy or systems change agenda? Are you coming together with other stakeholders, other service providers to advocate for shifts or increases in resources, negotiating more flexibility with your service delivery, with those categorical requirements? Do you really have that strong network of support to make more community-level change? And so, Courtney, if you want to talk a little bit more about the last part, reviewing your values.
Sure. So the other piece to this, once you've looked at your mission and your vision, you will also want to review your values. So these really look at, how do you want to treat others? How do we want to be treated ourselves? And what are our attitudes or values about our clients, or about our processes, or about our performance? And so, sometimes I think the values can almost have a tendency to kind of be pushed to the side as they're maybe not as important. But these are really kind of those guiding principles and priorities about the way that your agency is going to operate with respect to stakeholders, both external and internal. And so there's some different characteristics for effective value statements. You can look at, you want them to be specific, you want them to be shared by everyone, you want them to be phrased to convey real meaning with authenticity, not just some words you grabbed out of a dictionary. And then you want them to guide everyday actions of the leadership, the staff, and the board. So what's important here is that you really look at bringing values to life. And so on the next slide, we have, the different ways that you can do this. You want to be able to communicate values to all your stakeholders. So this is going to require multiple methods of doing that to be able to reinforce the information and integrate the concepts into the culture, as well as the planning process. And so it's one of those things where you want them to be visible to people, but you also want to display them through actions of how your agency operates and relates with others. So some different ideas of how you can, kind of communicate and also integrate the values on a day-to-day basis is through posting values in the workplace, so making them visible to staff as well as external stakeholders and clients that come in, recognizing people who integrate the values into their everyday work, and then also incorporating values into recruiting and the performance appraisal process. So making sure that the same sort of words are included in some of these, maybe your job descriptions and postings or performance appraisals, so that, it's really just integrated into the culture of the agency. And this can really help funnel into the agency capacity and staff engagement part of your strategic plan, kind of focusing in on when you talk about the agency growth and change. The values help to reinforce that as well.
Great. And Courtney, we had one last question come in. Someone asking about how you connect with other service providers to provide additional services when your agency, if your agency is relying primarily on internal referrals. And we'll talk about this in more detail on the next webinar. That's really what you're doing as you look at the strategies that you're going to develop. And that's exactly the type of question that you look at as you're developing your strategic plan. If you've identified gaps in services or a need for additional services, you go through another series of diagnostic questions. Is this something that we can provide in-house? Is this something that we can get additional resources to provide? Is it something that we need to partner with another agency? If we do need to partner with another agency, how do we build out that referral network? So we'll talk a little bit, we'll talk in more detail about the nitty-gritty of trying to address those types of situations the next time. But if you want additional follow-up, just write to Courtney and I directly with your questions, and we can provide you with much more detail. So we have 2 more webinars in this series on January 29th at the same time, 2 Eastern Standard, a week from today. We will be getting into more of those specifics around developing an outcomes-focused strategic plan. We'll look at defining clear outcomes that you're going to meet based on your needs assessment and the data that you've collected during this phase. We'll talk about developing strategies to get at exactly those kinds of questions folks have been raising. How do you deal with resource constraints? How do you identify your partners? And walk you through a process that you can use to hopefully answer some of those questions. And then finally, how do you develop concrete action plans to keep yourself on track and make sure that you've got a clear path forward to implement what you've committed to in your strategic plan. And then we'll wrap up on February 1st at 2 o'clock again on how to make sure you are implementing your strategic plan. So join us for the last 2 webinars in this series. Again, you can reach out directly to both Courtney and myself at our contact information up on the screen about what we've covered in both this webinar or other training and technical assistance needs that you might have. So the slides and the recording for this webinar should be up in the next couple of days along with those from the first webinar. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon. It's a privilege, as always, to serve the network, and please never hesitate to let Courtney, myself, or other partnership staff know if there's any other way we can support your work. So thank you all very much, and hope to see you the next time around or out there on the road.